Alrighty, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on the 54th session here at School 16. These are regular events that we host for the community, both for people that are just joining us, finding out about what we do here at School 16, and also our students, alumni, and students that are enrolling into our future programs. This is something that we've been offering from day one of when we launched School 16 in 2020, to really provide it as a resource, these learnings that we can get from professionals in the space, how they entered tech, how they navigated their careers, how they got leadership opportunities, what these roles actually mean. We know that oftentimes job titles can be somewhat opaque. They vary from company to company. You know, you can look at, and I encourage you to look up Anita on LinkedIn. And if you look at her profile, you'll probably think, how did she, tie a thread between these different roles? Certainly, she has an impressive background, but how do you convince somebody to give you opportunities from one type of job to another, from one industry to another, at a relatively young age as well? And it's all possible. And that's one of the reasons why we started this organization. Is tech is one of those industries where there's a lot of flexibility, and if you learn how to navigate it in the right way, you can really create your own career narrative. And that's really what we're here at School 16. That's one of our missions, is to empower anybody, regardless of experience, to create their own career narrative in an industry that we think is one of the most exciting industries, one of the most well-paying ones, that creates the most flexibility, which is why we talk about tech. We talk about business roles in tech specifically, typically because they're lower barriers to entry. So that's what we do here at School 16. And that's a little bit of a preface into what this event is all about, but we cover all sorts of business roles in tech when you come to our events. Today, though, we're going to be talking a little bit more focused on operations. Even though we're going to touch on product, we're going to touch a little bit on marketing, but operations is kind of the common thread that we can tie with Anita's experience here. So just wanted to, sorry about all the slides movement. Hopefully that wasn't too annoying for you. Wanted to jump to the agenda here real quick. We're just doing a quick introduction here in the first 5 minutes. We're going to start off the conversation with an introduction from Anita. We'll ask a couple of questions just to get to know her experience a little bit more before we dive into some of the specifics about how she got opportunities, and then some of those specifics about what these operations roles actually mean. This is where we'd love to hear your questions. I'm already seeing some come in the chat. Nerva asked a question, but feel free to continue asking questions throughout. We will be monitoring it here, and then we're gonna close the discussion in the second half about career advancement as well, and how to think about that once you actually do break into tech. So we're going to try to keep this as interactive as possible, meaning we typically ask as many of the questions as you have in the chat. We get to as many as we possibly can. Just keep in mind, of course, we may have some specific questions that we want to ask, but please be sure to ask a question that's hopefully relevant to, of course, Anita's experience, but also relevant to other folks to be able to learn on the call as well. If you have something very, very specific that's really unique to your situation, we're happy to address that maybe after the call offline as well. We also want to mention that if you are interested in actually going deeper, you actually have been trying to get into tech, but perhaps for one reason or another, you haven't been able to make that much progress yourself. This is why we created our 8-week technology career acceleration program, where you can learn from professionals in the space who are doing these jobs day to day. This is just a sample of some of our instructors and mentors that we involve in our programs, who actually spend time teaching classes across operations, product management, marketing, and sales, so that you get a broad perspective into how technology organizations work. You understand where you fit in, and you understand how to position yourself for these roles with the help of our instructors, career coaches, and mentors. So if you're looking for a hands-on experience through an 8-week educational model with live classes, with a lot of interaction and networking, we encourage you to apply. Our classes tend to fill up quite quickly. We already started recruiting our February cohort because our January cohort just filled up. And the link to apply there is school16.co/apply. We'll remind you again by dropping these links too, so don't worry. Actually, Vadim just dropped. Thank you, Vadim. But we'll drop them again in the end if you need it. but I am now excited to kick off our conversation with Anita Tang. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Anita. You and I spoke, seems like a while ago now, maybe like early December, to schedule this event, and I knew it was going to be popular among our community. So really excited to have you. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I think what you guys are doing at School16 is super cool. So props to that.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Well, then just to kick things off, Anita, I'd love to hear a little bit, just to start off, about your early career, because I think, it's easy to think when you look at someone who has the experiences that you do with the job titles that you do, and, you actually have it broken down really well in your LinkedIn, the achievements that you've had in your jobs starting in finance. It's easy to think that it's premeditated, that you knew exactly what you were doing every step of the way. Maybe even you started planning this when you were in college. I saw that you had leadership experience in college as well. And so I'm curious, let's take it back to your college days, because that's when most of us are thinking about how we're going to create a career for ourselves. Was tech on your radar? How were you thinking about kicking off your career so that you would be someone that could be competitive in the marketplace?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. So I went to school in Canada, which I'm based out of Toronto still. And when I was in school, I don't think product or tech was a company or industry that people really fought to be in. I went to business school. So there were three careers: either end up in finance, accounting, or consulting. And believe it or not, accounting was actually sort of my path at the time. I did all the accounting courses and wanted to be an accountant. And in our last year of university, we go through recruiting. And of course, nobody in the accounting industry wanted to hire me. So I had to pivot really quickly. So I ended up being in finance. So my first job was in the Canadian pension plan. So focusing on investment. I was part of the rotational program. So got a little bit of experiences in different asset classes. So hedge funds, private equity, and derivatives as well. So going back to your question, no, actually, tech was not on my radar. Accounting was, but it never panned out.
And at what point did it become, was it something that came on your radar, something that you started considering? Because I can see that you spent a number of years in that company, and you even changed titles a couple times. You ended up getting an operations title. So it's, you were clearly working toward promotions, but at what point did it come on your radar, and did you actually start thinking about a transition?
Yeah, so I think towards the end of my rotational program, which was about 2 years, because I had the opportunity to try out different jobs within the finance world, finance wasn't kind of what I was striving to build my career in. And I think one of the reasons is that it's very difficult to see your impact in an investment fund, right? Let's say you make 20% return for the fund. It doesn't really translate into much other than maybe a fatter bonus check at the end of the day. So I want to make, or at least be in a career that I could see tangible impact on my job. So then I transitioned into corporate strategy role, which is a big jump from finance to corporate strategy, particularly in telco. So, and the reason for that jump was that, again, wanted to be more impactful in my job, have a consumer facing side to the role. And being sort of a finance person, it's hard to jump into something like a product manager at a company like this right away. So corporate strategy, being more of a generalist role within the organization, was more of a natural path.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I can see here that after a little less than 2 years, you were able to get a product manager role in that company. I can see how you're starting to make that, it's an incremental transition where you went from the finance and accounting person to now in a telco, which is a different type of technology company, but a technology company. How did you, that was sort of the first transition that you made that, I'm sure you had to justify to that organization why they should take a chance on you in this corporate strategy role. Now, to some extent, okay, they can see you're smart, you can do a finance job, but did that come up when you made that initial jump from strictly finance to corporate strategy at the telco, and how did you handle that transition?
Yeah, so the corporate strategy role within the telco is actually very interesting because we get to work with different business units. And we're basically the internal consultants for the CEO, for different presidents of the business units. So you get to work with different stakeholders at different levels. As you are proposing and getting analysis for some of these strategies, you have to work with the people who are at the forefront. So usually the product teams. And I think I was quite lucky in a sense that I got tapped on the shoulder and I was asked if I wanted to move into a product manager role within the same company. I debated for quite a bit. And one of the reasons is because, as you know, as an internal consultant, oftentimes you do a lot of analysis to propose the recommendation, but you don't really need to execute. And that's typically passed on to the business teams. So this role would require very different skill set than the roles that I was used to in both finance and the strategy world. So it was a back and forth debate for a long time. And I think what kind of pushed me over to the product side is that speaking with the team, you understand that, not just execution is not the only part of product management. A lot of it is about stakeholder management. A lot of it is being able to leverage analysis to prove your case on why your product should be launched this way, or why your product is a good idea for the company to invest in and build. So lucky enough that I got tapped on the shoulder and then debated quite a bit before actually moving into that product role.
Do you have any thoughts as to why they tapped you on the shoulder specifically? I mean, did they just need people and they saw that you were smart, or was there something more to it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the product that I ended up inheriting was at their in the beginning, right? So a lot of times it's new innovation that the company or at least the team wanted to tackle, and they needed someone who is able to have that narrative or have that storytelling narrative to be able to convince executives, convince the leadership that it's a product that's worth investing, but also being able to communicate to the different teams, so the engineering teams, the go-to-market teams, marketing, why this is valuable, and therefore work on this project together collaboratively to launch something into the market that we've never seen before. So I think definitely the strategy experience helped a lot. And I think at the time with that role, it was a lot of stakeholder management with leadership. So the relationship has already been built. So making it much easier for me, I think, to communicate the value of this product to leadership. So I think part of it was the strategy experience. And then I think part of it is being able to rally the team around to ship something that we've never done before.
So I'm curious then, since stakeholder management and trying to organize different humans with different priorities to go to the same direction is it's a difficult skill set, and I think it's difficult to prove, and it's also difficult to acquire. I'm wondering, can you point to some specific examples or work situations that you had either in the previous role in that company or in the finance organization you were in before that you think set you up to be able to step into that product role from day one and be effective?
Yeah, I think specifically on the stakeholder management, as I kind of referenced before, I was in a rotational program. So I had 5 different managers in that 2-year time frame. So being able to understand and align with what they're looking for and be able to execute what they're asking you of is super important. So I think definitely from that perspective, like the communication skill set and the softer skills to work with different types of people have sort of been started to develop that way. And of course, in strategy role, same thing, right? You have presidents and CEO who have a different interaction that you would have to engage with compared to, let's say, the VP of product, or even sort of the product managers that we work with day to day on the strategy role. So being able to kind of understand and work through that organization at all these levels, I think was what allowed me to develop the skills to better manage stakeholders and understand how to communicate with them that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in that communication, what was critical is your ability to collect data and analyze data and present it in a way that can convince people that a certain direction can be taken. Now, obviously, in a finance role, you're doing a lot of data analysis and modeling and the like. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how that's a skill set that somebody can develop, either on their own time or perhaps if they have another type of job where they can work on that skill set of packaging data in a way that you can actually then present it to convince people to do something. It's such an important skill set for any role, I think, but in particular for operations and product roles. So any thoughts on maybe how you did that when you were first learning how to do that, and how much somebody might do that on their own time?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm actually planning a sort of a workshop for our data science team to teach them how to tell better stories with the data that they use every day. I think that, at least for me, as I was going through school, we did a lot of case studies. And as I was going through recruiting, we also do a lot of case study prep. I think case study is a very good mechanism to learn how to communicate and understand data and present it in a really good way. For the interviews that we do for product ops, as you can imagine, at Shopify product ops, it's very important to understand data and how to leverage data to communicate to the right stakeholders in terms of what they needed to do with that data. So a case interview is kind of our assessment of how well that candidate can take all these data presented in a narrative that makes sense for the different stakeholders. So I think case study is definitely one. The other, I think, in the strategy role, you have to do a lot of different presentations, and I think the practice makes perfect. I still remember the first presentation that I did. It was horrible because I used Excel and created like a bar chart, and nobody could understand what I was trying to present. And with guidance and coaching from my manager at the time, like now I'm able to understand what chart, how I could, communicate data in the most visually clear way to whoever I need to speak with. So I think case study, and also if there's opportunity to do presentations, that I think would be helpful in developing that skill.
Certainly, all it takes is one time feeling the pressure of not doing as well as you thought you could in a presentation, and you really have that internal motivation to
That's right.
improve.
I think my boss was like, "What the hell is this?" was what he said to me. So definitely, that's a great
that
motivator.
worked. Got it. Great. Well, I do want to get in a few minutes here to what your product operation roles entails. But before I do that, you went from spending time in this organization and going from a relatively large company where you were a product manager to then going to more of a startup as a product strategist, and then after that a product marketing lead. So a couple of seemingly different roles. Can you talk a little bit about how you made that transition? And I'm curious to hear. I mean, if I'm sitting here and I don't have much experience in this, I'm wondering to myself, like, why are people, I mean, sure, you were a product manager, you were ops and finance before. Why are people hiring you for these startups, for these roles that seem related, but not exactly related? So talk a little bit about how you decided on those roles and how you actually navigated that transition.
Yeah, so right after the PM role at the telco, I actually intentionally wanted to be in an AI space. And at the time, AI was the buzzword everywhere. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about the industry and sort of understand the opportunity within it. So I intentionally looked for AI companies. And at the time, AI companies are relatively small, so there are startups. So I didn't really intentionally look for startups more so than AI companies, but AI companies were a startup at the time. And I actually was okay with doing any role within the AI startup, but the one that the company thought that was most relevant was the product strategy role, given I was a PM and I was in a corporate strategy role previously. I think there's probably some maybe myths in terms of like breaking into tech or breaking into startup when you don't have that experience. And sometimes it's true, but I think more true is that when you're in a startup, you need to show certain qualities. For example, you're able to wear multiple hats. You're able to work, have good work ethics, work hard, and understand how to work smart as well, so not just work hard. And I think oftentimes through interviews, now that I'm on the other side, through interviews, you can see a lot of those softer qualities from the individual. So perhaps maybe they don't have those skill sets, which at the time, I think I didn't have a product strategy experience or skill sets. But I think through the interviews, I could showcase I could actually do the job without having that experience. So I was there at the AI company for about a year, and then I got tapped on the shoulder to be to lead the product marketing role within a fintech. I actually never thought I would want to be in marketing, and I think my partner is in marketing, and a lot of the things that they work on, like campaign brands, like that's not things I'm super interested. So I initially was not interested in the role at all. But the more I hear about it, the product marketing function is actually very, very different than like a traditional marketing role that most of us are privy to. And I think being in the product marketing role, you really need to understand marketing, but you also, you really need to understand product, how it works, but also the business side, how the business operates, like the sales component. So I think, again, like my experiences have bits of that, and kind of in the interview, I could showcase I could do the product marketing role, even though I've never done it before. So then I joined that team to lead their product marketing function. When I joined, there was no one doing product marketing, so sort of build the team from the ground up there. Yeah, so about a year and a half after, I think I looked into sort of what else I could do within this product space. So I've done product management, I've done product strategy, I've done product marketing and product ops. At the time, Shopify was expanding really quickly. So then I decided to join that team at Shopify.
Well, okay, I want to ask you about Shopify in a second here. Really quickly, by the way, I think maybe you moved and your camera did something with the focus. You're a little blurry.
Yeah.
But
this camera autofocuses itself, and sometimes it doesn't do a good job.
There we go. There we go. We can see you now well. Before I jump into the product ops role, you mentioned that when you were interviewing or when you went to Element AI, you just cared more about joining an AI company. It happened to be a startup at the time. But you hadn't done product strategy before, but you could convince them that you could do the job. Similarly, product marketing hadn't done it before, but you could convince them that you had the ability to learn and do the job. Do you recall how you were able to do that in those interviews, how you were able to convince people that your previous experience was going to be transferable enough to make you immediately productive?
Yeah, for sure. If I recall, the sort of the denominator for both of the interviews is, of course, we go through behavioral, right? And then they ask very specific questions, or ask you a scenario and ask you how you would handle it. I think that's a good insight into how somebody would think, and how they would go about to solve for the problem, or how they would execute on the work. So some of the behavioral questions, I think, helped shape how I think, and as a result, they sort of translated that into how it would be applicable to the role. And then sort of going back to that case study, both interviews, I've done case studies. Again, very similar to behavioral, but instead of asking about how you have previously done it, it's like on the spot. It's a brand new sort of scenario that maybe you have never faced before. And again, based on your thinking, your mental framework, they can, I guess, assess how you would handle situations like this if it does arise in that role. So I think those were the two kind of denominator that I recognize in those interviews. And it's very typical within tech, right? Now that I'm on the other side now, case interview is almost a must-have in all tech interviews. Oftentimes it's on the spot, but sometimes they ask you to take home. I've done those interviews before. But that is, I think, is a good way to assess a candidate when maybe they previously have not had those experiences before.
I'm going to ask you later, Vadim, maybe you can remind me to ask Anita later how you run the case interviews now, how you evaluate people now when you're interviewing. But before I do that, I'm curious, was there anything, since you were going into these interviews into the relatively new territory, was there anything specific you did to prepare for those interviews? Like, did you seek advice from anyone? Did you just Google around product strategy? Let me see what I should talk about here. How did you go about that?
Yeah, I think definitely read through the job description, right? Usually it's very indicative of the type of people that they're looking for and the experience or the ability to execute those experiences. So oftentimes I would prep, let's say, the behavioral based on some of those bullet points on the JD, on the job description. I have a book of questions and answers that I've sort of prepped that I know previously they've asked, whether it's learned from, let's say, Glassdoor or in other interviews of similar positions. So I definitely have that in my back pocket in order to prep for those interviews. And then the third is, if possible, speaking with people within that organization, even if it's not the same role that you're applying for, helps a lot because it gives you a sense of what the culture of that organization would be and sort of the type of people that they're looking for. So I don't do this often, but sometimes I would cold message folks that are in my network or my network to see if they're interested in like a 10-minute chat just to learn a little bit more about their job and their organization. Not successful all the time, but sometimes the odd one will reply and that becomes a good conversation and good insight gathering.
Now, throughout this story, there's been a couple times where you were tapped on the shoulder for particular roles, including this product marketing lead role before you joined Shopify. And one of the questions in the chat here is from Nirva about if there's anything special you added to your resume. Do you have a sense as to how people seek you out? Was it that your LinkedIn profile was so comprehensive? Was it that you had your resume listed in places where people can find you? How did people find you? Why do you think they seek you out?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. My resume is quite typical. It's very action and impact oriented, which I think a lot of us do so. So I don't think there's anything special there. My LinkedIn profile, as you can tell, it's basically sort of copy and paste of those impact in there. Maybe it's a little bit more detailed than some. But yeah, that's a good question. What's the secret sauce? Parts of it, I think, is referral or network. Sort of within, like when I talked about the PM role at the telco, one of the reasons why I got tapped on and I later found out was that a girl on my team was vouching for me hard when the product director asked her about me, which was great. So that helped move things along a lot faster. The product marketing lead role, yeah, that was a question mark to me too. So maybe my LinkedIn was more detailed with more impact focused description than some. Maybe that was kind of the secret sauce.
I mean, I can see just by looking at your LinkedIn, in the roles that you've had in the past, first of all, it's very digestible. It's very impact oriented. I can see exactly what you were able to accomplish in those roles. And it looks like you actually had a ownership over these roles, over the impact that you've had. And I think that definitely helps tell a story. So that gives me a little bit of a hint. Okay, cool. Thank you for giving us a hint a little bit into why you were able to get those opportunities. Very clear to me that focusing on the job that you have today and doing a really good job on that is going to help provide opportunities. Like that person on the team who was vouching for you, that didn't happen by accident. She obviously was confident in your work, and she was confident in what you would be able to do in another role. So I can see that very clearly. So let's now get into the product operations role at Shopify. Was that something that came to you as well, or did you say, hey, Shopify, really cool brand, I really want to work there, and I really want to get into product ops? How did that come about, and how did you land that role?
Yeah, so product ops was always a question mark to me. I think it's a relatively new role in the tech industry overall. But I knew I wanted to be in a bigger tech company. So being in finance, which was thousands of people, to telco, tens of thousands of people, and then to hundreds of people, and then to less than 100 people startup. I wanted to jump back into a bigger organization, but that also is in tech. And one of the reasons why is because tech companies tend to move fast. I think being in finance and telco scarred me a little bit in terms of processes and the way things are being done. So definitely Shopify was one of the companies on my list to look out for. I had a conversation with the lead, my manager now, about the role, and it seemed really, really interesting. And there's a couple of reasons why it's super interesting. As I mentioned, the product ops role is relatively new within the industry and definitely quite new within Shopify. I think I joined early last year is when they started to expand the craft, the discipline within Shopify. And we're continuously hiring and expanding now. So a lot of the opportunities, it's brand new, right? Like you oftentimes have to create the role for yourself. And that's what excited me to this role. I can focus on the things that I know will drive impact and things that I like to do and sort of combine that in this role. And not a lot of places give you that opportunity. I think being in a tech company and having the resources to invest and allow you to do things like this. So that I think that's definitely a key reason why I joined the product ops role at Shopify.
Well, it sounds really interesting. So I'm curious then, in your own words, even though it's a new role and even though it varies from company to company, how would you describe what product operations is? And Madeline just asked in the chat, what does a typical day consist of? Maybe that's a good way of trying to describe what the role entails.
Yeah, I think the TLDR of the role is that product ops is, I guess, a role or function that minimizes blind spots and visibility within the organization. And there's a lot to unpack there. So if you think about an organization like Shopify that's grown exponentially, the problems that we solve for is a lot more complex, and the people who solve for these problems there are a lot more compared to like a startup, right? So oftentimes you would have perhaps situations where one product team is working on one thing and another product team is working on another. And it turns out they're working on the same thing, but they haven't communicated to each other. And there's lack of visibility between the two teams because the company is so large that they miss that. And that's the blind spot that we product ops want to mitigate and eliminate, actually. So the day-to-day varies. Really depends on what's happening during the cycle in the quarter. But I'd say one thing that we focuses on is to ensure that the goals of our teams are being communicated to the right stakeholders. So then if there's context missing from a project team level, that can be shared. And if there are decisions that the teams haven't made, that can be shared. So as an example, in the morning, I would, let's say, work with the product teams on setting their goals for the next 6 weeks. in terms of what the milestones that they want to achieve in the next 6 weeks. And then let's say in the afternoon, I would maybe working on a plan to figure out how we can organize a quarterly business review with all the leadership and all the key stakeholders in one spot, so that we can talk about some of these decisions, some of these risks, and some of the problems that we're trying to solve for in this quarter, next quarter, et cetera. Yeah, it does vary quite a bit. I hopefully answer that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to me as these departments in tech develop, there's sort of new layers being added in. Like product marketing used to not really exist, right? It used to be marketing and product, and now there's like a layer. Product operations seems like yet another new layer, because when you're telling me about, let's say, meeting with a product team, helping them prioritize the next 6 weeks, well, in my mind, I'm like, isn't it the product team's job to help others prioritize their 6 weeks? So like we're adding another layer. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why do you think product operation has emerged as a discipline? Why is there a need for it now?
You actually, I think, touch a point that is very important. If you think about, let's say, a company that has maybe 10 people, right? The product guy is typically the marketing guy as well, like you mentioned. They're probably also the sales guy, and maybe to a degree, they're also the engineering guy. And in a smaller organization, product ops doesn't exist because the product manager is doing that. They're sharing the context with the CEO, perhaps, or the different, leadership. They don't get blindsided because they have visibility into everything, because it's a company of 10 or 20. So I think product ops, you'll probably only see product ops as a function when a company gets to critical mass. And I think Shopify is at that point right now, and that's why like the product ops role becomes important. Sort of going back to the day-to-day, we don't have a day-to-day because oftentimes we do everything. Maybe we're planning stuff, or helping the team prioritize goals. We're helping our VP figure out headcount. Maybe we're talking to the engineering team to understand, hey, why is this team blocked for 2 weeks with no progress? So a lot of these things, I think, previously, like in a small organization, again, product would be doing that, but because product needs to be focusing on very, very problems are very pointed, very focused. Therefore, they don't have the capacity or the time to do all these other activities, which are super important. So I think that's why the product ops function becomes an important one as a company grows in size and in complexity.
Thank you for that context. That's really helpful. College just asked actually interesting question. Who does product ops report to at the organization then?
Yeah, so I think there's different structure in terms of how product ops is organized within an organization. I've seen other companies where product ops report into product lead. For within Shopify, we report to the VP of ops. So we have operations, and one of the reasons why we have a lead for ops is because other than product ops, there's also business ops, which focuses much more on sort of the financial aspects of the organization. So things like understanding budget, costs, and all of that product ops, because it's not related to product, don't really typically touch.
Understood. Okay. So then, I want to go back to the sort of theme of this event, which, you started your career off in a rotational program. You really, I think, truly have been a generalist through your career. You're kind of a chameleon, it seems. You can do whatever you want, whatever you decide to do. But it's a challenge. Yes. Or maybe the facade, but hey, it's working for you. So, but the challenge, I think, is, I think to some extent it helps to brand yourself as a generalist, but it's also easy to fall under the trap of being labeled someone that doesn't have a focus. Any thoughts about how you can avoid that? Any thoughts about how you were able to take your sort of generalist persona, but
Yeah.
actually use it as a strength?
For sure. I think so probably before I moved into the product ops role, I had a confusion, like a confused part. It's like exactly what you just mentioned. I'm pretty much a generalist. I have experiences in XYZ, but I don't go deep into one. And then a book that I read that was actually super helpful is I might get the title wrong, but it's like how does a generalist triumph in the world? And I could find the name, the exact name, and then the author, and then could share that with you guys so you could share with folks on the call. But one thing that stuck with me in the book is that generalists actually have a different perspective than somebody who's a specialist, right? And oftentimes they have different ways of thinking of solving problems than a specialist who is deep in their role. So I think that book sort of inspired me and gave me hope that being a generalist is actually helpful. And I think I didn't see that until I moved into the operation product apps role at Shopify, because sort of based on my previous experience, as a PM, I have to work with engineers, and therefore I understand how PM thinks and work, and also how they work with engineers. So therefore, my interaction with PMs in terms of helping them prioritize goals, et cetera, becomes a lot easier because I'm kind of speaking their language. And then my strategy role, I interface a lot with executives. So now speaking or talking to VP, I'm able to communicate in a way that is at sort of a high level, but very pointed. So then they only need to know the context that they need to know, instead of telling them a whole story about, XYZ event that happened. And then I think the product marketing experience allowed me to understand sort of how to turn insights in the markets and then feed that into product development. And that's sort of one area that, as we grow our PMO function at Shopify, that's probably an area that we focus a little bit more on. And having that experience can help inform teams with things like playbooks of how do we think about market research? How do we think about go-to-market? How do we think about when products are being launched? What are the, let's say, metrics that we need to keep track of? So I think having those experiences helped inform this product ops role and allow me to communicate and be more effective in this job. So now I tell people I'm a T. Like, if you think of an individual as a T, I'm like a generalist, but my focus, like the straight line within T, is product, because I have XYZ product experience. So
it's very helpful when you're thinking about your next step, and then when you're looking into your career in hindsight to figure out what that thread is. For you, it's product, but then you're able to bring in all these other experiences that you've had to justify why you could be good at a job. So then I do want to address, we have a lot of great questions coming in here. I want to address some folks here. In particular, you mentioned case studies and preparing for case studies. And that's one of the questions that Gillian asked a little bit earlier, a few minutes ago, which is, any recommendation for preparing for interviews like that? And if you can provide any context for how you go about evaluating people now when you're talking to someone, when you're trying to present a case study for them to answer, what you look for, how does someone stand out in your experience where they seem like a really strong candidate, going through that? Any advice there that you could give?
For sure. There's actually a lot of great resources on the internet on how to prep for case studies. And I think, at least when I was researching back then, is a lot more focusing on consulting, but the concept is the same, right? So it tells you frameworks to use, things to think about as you're going through the case study. And again, like the more you do, the more it becomes natural. So highly recommend looking for some of the case studies and break down on how to actually solve them. Now that on the other side, I think the right answers to the case study actually don't matter, because there are multiple ways to solve one problem. What I typically look for is, does this person have a mental framework to solve problems? Sometimes it would have candidates that would say, like, X, and then they would then jump to Y, and then they never connect the dot. And oftentimes that's because they're thinking on the spot, but they don't have a great mental framework or model to guide their thinking. So being able to think structurally, and this is all like you can learn that, right? Understanding framework online, doing more practices on case study, like it becomes sort of second nature. So definitely structural thinking when evaluating a candidate is super important. The second is oftentimes candidates jump in right away without asking questions. And in a real life scenario, you rarely jump in and tackle a problem. You often have to gather context. So I also look for candidates who ask questions. Some questions are better than others, but there's no sort of wrong questions. But seeing candidate asking questions and the type of questions they ask then help you inform how they would actually tackle this in a real life scenario. And then I think the third is when I did case study, I'm more interactive. I've been in case study as the interviewee where it's like you go and there's no interaction. But I think that's actually not conducive to understanding how that person would think or actually apply some of these learnings in a real scenario. So my interaction with them also is a weighing factor. And the things that I look for is, if I ask clarifying questions, how do they handle it? Do they become nervous, or do they start rambling? Or are they able to have a normal conversation with me and maybe even ask me follow-up questions? So those are typically the three things that I would assess. And of course, we have a very detailed rubric on like the pieces of skill sets that we're looking for different roles, so product ops being one of the roles. But typically those are the three things that are more general across case studies that I think interviewers look for.
And one of the things you mentioned is at least having a mental framework for solving problems. Any particular resources or types of frameworks that people should be researching, or just kind of generally Google framework for problem solving?
Yeah, so specific for a product ops role, because we do engage with product managers and that product management team, a resource that I would recommend checking out is a Black Box of Product Management. Actually, the author now works at Shopify, so it's super, super interesting. But I think at one point it was kind of like the gospel for product management, because there's a lot of good insights and mental framework that PMs from different industries could apply. So I think that would be one that I would highly recommend.
Great, thank you for sharing that. We had some questions come in from Yamna and Jessica and a few other folks about preparing yourself for these types of careers. And in particular, some folks are wondering, do you think targeting, if you're trying to break into tech and trying to navigate your way into some of these product roles or operations roles, would you recommend starting off at a startup company? When you look at candidates now and you're kind of scanning resumes, is that an asset, or the particular roles that people have had in the past that you find are an asset? Or how would you think about that for someone that's really trying to navigate an entry point into tech?
Yeah, I guess there's two sort of answer to that. If you're a little bit more junior, and you can afford to take a more junior role, afford meaning time, not so much money, then I think going straight into like a APM role would be helpful in order for you to kind of break into that. And Shopify has a great APM program. But if, let's say, you're a little bit more senior and you want to break into tech or product, I think it's a little bit difficult, particularly for product role, because it is a role that requires experiences. And I think it's difficult for you to be assessed without that experience. And typically, I think you won't even get past the first round of interview. So one thing that I could think of is actually look for a role within the company that you want to work for, whether it's startup or a tech company, and just penetrate at first and then transition afterwards. So a lot of companies have great programs internally for you to try new roles and try different functions within the same company. So getting your foot in the door, I think, could be a good way for someone who's a little bit more senior. I have seen friends of mine and coworkers of mine who was in a partner role and then went to become like a product manager, which typically is a lot more junior than a partner within a firm. And they were able to progress really quickly. So that's not to say, like, if you want to sort of take a pay cut, take a title cut, and you really, really want to step foot in the product role, that could also be an option. And then based on your previous experience, likely you will progress really quickly. So two kind of roles, like junior roles, start from the bottom up, I think would make sense. If you're a little bit more senior, maybe think about going into a separate function and then transitioning once you have your foot in the door.
And that's exactly what you did. I mean, you got your first product related opportunity in a company you were already in a strategic role, right? And so you were able to jump in an internal company and use that to then get into a technology company strictly, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's typically the easiest way. If you don't have that experience and want to break into it. I have seen some organizations are a little bit more particular about transitioning roles. But in like most of the companies that understand talent, understand that is a very much valuable program for internal employees to move around. So I would watch out for that as well, like understanding the culture of the company to see if that transition is possible and it's sort of not frowned upon within the organization.
And I really like your advice on, if you're trying to get into tech, maybe if you're a little bit more senior, not just coming from undergrad, for example, of just focusing on companies that you like, get your foot in the door in a technology company based on whatever makes sense based on your previous experience. If it's more sales or customer focused or marketing focused, get that role that's more relevant to your previous experience. And then you can transition to another path within that company and then perhaps another company down the line. But one of the things you mentioned the APM, apprenticeship program management role at Shopify. There's not a whole lot of entry level product roles at companies. I'm curious, given that, and given that people are looking for entry level product roles and companies are probably very competitive, what would you say makes a candidate stand out at the entry level who maybe just has some experience with internships in college or whatever, to make them actually a candidate that you would consider for even a junior product role? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sort of tying to what I spoke about earlier, if you're more junior, people want to assess your potential because, of course, you don't have a lot of experience. Maybe you have a couple of internships under your belt. Most people don't. So being able to showcase you have the potential to do the job. So as you transition from an APM to a PM and beyond, I think that's super important. The other thing I think is that if you're a more junior person, and this is kind of perhaps a little bit more subjective, like coachable is another, I think, quality that as people are hiring junior people would look for. So not being, and I apologize if this is offensive, but like, don't be a know-it-all, right? Or you think you know everything and therefore, and you kind of showcase in the way that you carry yourself, in the way that you interview, right? Like people want to have somebody who they can help coach and help guide them to that right path of being from a APM to a PM. So I think coachability is another one. And then I think the third, which is kind of similar, is sort of the growth mindset, right? Oftentimes people will ask you, oh, where do you want to be in 5 years? And people I've seen are cautious when they answer that question, right? one friend of mine told me, yeah, she answered one way, and then her boss is like, that's a wrong answer because you should strive for my spot or my VP spot in 5 years. So being able to have that growth mindset and able to articulate that or showcase that, I think is also super important. So for junior folks like that, the potential, the coachability, and then the growth mindset, I think is important to showcase.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anita. That is super helpful. I think a great question to close the event here. I see we're a little bit past the hour already, so we thank you so much for spending all this time with us. I feel like we could go on forever because your experience is so rich that we can touch on so many of these different roles. But I think this was a great introduction for those who were curious, and hopefully we were able to address as many questions as we could. I'm just going to share my screen here really quickly as we wrap up. We really appreciate for anyone that joined this event. We're going to send a quick post-event survey. We'll drop it in the chat here. We just want to hear how it went for you. We're able to answer your questions. Is there anything else that you were hoping to learn? So just general feedback would be super helpful. And if you want to hear more about events like this, if you're on our email list already, you'll hear it, but you can also follow us on both LinkedIn if you just type in School16, or Instagram. And then we do have another event coming up next week with Liron Anolik, strategy and operations principal at Google. So we're going to continue the theme of talking about operations. As you can see, these roles vary quite a lot between companies. So do check that out if you can. But once again, and I can see already some thank yous coming into the chat here. Thank you folks for joining. Thank you so much, Anita, for your transparency and telling us your story. Yeah, of course.
This is a super fun event. Definitely did not realize the time has gone by. So again, guys, for inviting me. And this was super fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And folks, if you didn't get an answer, didn't get a question answered, feel free to reach out to us directly. You have our email addresses, but also Anita, if you're open to it, if folks can add you on LinkedIn. So add Anita on LinkedIn. You heard it here from her.
Make sure you say you're from School16, so I will respond to that. Yeah,
so on LinkedIn, you can add a little note that in your connection request, and you can let Anita know that you met her at School16. We encourage everybody here to do it, especially if you're joining. Hey, Raphael, good to see you. Raphael's an alumnus from our previous cohort. If you're joining us, if you're someone that's just joined our program, that we constantly ask our students to do this kind of networking when you're building relationships with people, just like Anita did throughout her career. So do make sure that if you add her on LinkedIn, you provide some context there so she knows where you're coming from. But thank you folks again for joining us, and we're going to let you go and get to the rest of your evening here, Anita. But again, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Have a great one.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.